Okay.
All right, I've got some news and I'm gonna share my screen and dive right into it. I put up an article yesterday, why all the secrecy? And Paula, feel free, by all means to chime in with any questions that you have. So
Thank you.
the news of the day is that the WHO and their International Health Regulations Review Committee finally published a report 3 weeks after they met and formed their official committee and put out a report on their first meeting. They picked their chairperson and their co-chair and so forth. And in the document about that meeting that was on October 6th, they included this interesting information, which is not yet the actual amendments that are proposed. But they did say, oh, Bangladesh has submitted, they want to propose amendments to Articles 1, 2, 3, 13, 44, and Annex number 1. And so what I did yesterday was I tried to organize this in a way to get people to encourage them to look at the international health regulations, okay? And so Bangladesh seems to be going right at the heart of it. They're looking at Article 1, 2, and 3, along with other groups, definitions, purpose and scope, and principles. Well, my goodness, if you want to change the purpose and the scope and the principles, that's kind of sort of important. Now, Bangladesh has been sort of good in many of the meetings, posing good questions. I have a little bit of hope that maybe some of this will be beneficial. But I'm just going to blow through this really quickly. Part 2 of the international health regulations is very meaty stuff. And you'll see that the United States wants to change a lot of this, okay? This is what the United States tried to do earlier in the year. And the list of articles that they're supposedly wanting to amend this time around are nearly identical, with just one missing that was amended last time. It sure looks like they're probably going to submit the same thing they submitted last time. So we're talking surveillance and then notification of that surveillance, okay? If there is a health event, a lot of people showing up at the hospital with some weird ailment, someone getting off a cruise ship or an airplane or whatever, having some weird problems, okay? The EU wants to talk about information sharing, right? And verification, a lot of things. The big one here that has 7 nations that want to talk about how is a public health emergency of international concern determined. This was the explosive one from the United States back in May. Okay, and there's also 7 nations, different, or 7 groups anyways, about the public health response. And so I'm relatively well I've familiarized myself with the IHR, and hopefully this will help people see that, a big part of this is recommendations, okay? They make temporary recommendations, they make standing recommendations, there's criteria for making those recommendations, and then there's recommendations for specific things. Interestingly enough, a lot of nations are focused on Article 18, right? So we'll see what's coming there. Strangely enough, points of entry, airports, ports, ground crossings, authorities, South American group has something to say about that. But, that's interesting that that's not much change, talking about that. Health measures on arrival and departure. This is where the people, I think, should have something to say. I certainly have things I want to say about Article 23. And, 4 groups, including the EU and the Russian group, have something to say about that. But, interestingly enough, Japan and India, but again, not a whole lot of wanting to change there. Same thing here. And these are the ones that I find I want to change. These are the ones that, so it makes sense. They want to change the stuff that is probably pretty good, and they don't want to change the stuff that I think is not so great at all. There's health documents, I mean, you can read that as green pass or, digital passport or whatever. Not too much about maritime and ships and things like that. This one concerns me. The EU, right? The EU wants to change something to do with certifications of vaccination. They talk about money for people who are quarantined and whether or not you get to charge people for, I don't know, food and lodging, room and board when they're being quarantined. So nobody's changing any of that. And just some general provisions. Okay, again, decent amount of change going on here. The committee that was considering all of this comes out of the IHR roster of experts, and the emergency committee is people want to change how that operates. And last time, somewhere around here, the review committee and the emergency committee, I think the United States wanted to add a compliance committee, okay, which gets into having authority to enforce things. Then you get down into the annexes, which is where really the rubber hits the road. Okay, really the international health regulations are mostly about core capacity requirements to surveil and respond to whatever you surveil, right? Airports, ground crossings, and essentially, hospitals and so forth. 5 nations, are changing really the core requirements of the IHRs, right? Only Brazil and Japan. This is actually an interesting flow chart. Annex 2 is a flow chart of, oh, if you think you have a problem in your country, then you do this, and if yes or no, then you do that, and if yes or no, you do that, and oh, you've got to report it, and it's going to be a public health emergency of international concern, and goes on and on and on and on and on to the point where there are only currently 9 annexes, but apparently the African nations want to create a new one, and so all of these documents are available, down below, easy links for people to look through it. My request is that, they've obviously, around the world, 14 nations and groups of nations have probably had, I'm just going to say, hundreds of people put their brain power on this to craft things that, we don't know what they are yet. They've got much conflict, potentially amongst 7 groups wanting to change how you declare a emergency. Maybe they'll make it better, but my goal, and if you read the thing that I put in the Telegram earlier, I think that we, the people, should have an opposing. Well, maybe it'll be an opposing, and maybe it'll be right in alignment. Maybe everything we say we want is what they're going to do, but I doubt it. And so it's always a good exercise to say, hey, WHO and delegates to the member nations, you go over there and you make the recommendations that you want to make, and I'll go and make the recommendations that I or we want to make. And when you're ready, you show us yours and we'll show you ours. And I think what's going to happen is when we put the 2 next to each other, it's going to be like oil and water. It's going to be like matter and antimatter. It's just going to be like, what we're going to see is that they are so crazy, drunk with trying to get more power and control, and we're so on a different planet that the only reasonable thing is to say it's time to leave the WHO. You don't negotiate with terrorists, and you can't try to convince people who are crazy. Okay, and if somebody's trying to get power and you're trying to keep power, that's oil and water. It's just not going to mix. It's time to leave. You guys can have your nice little playground. We're leaving. And but I think that we have an opportunity to get that into people's minds before they have a chance to lay their propaganda down.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And also to raise again, knowledge about the existence of this institution and what they are really doing, etc.,
Mhm,
etc. Is a great opportunity. We should remember. I want to make a couple of comments. We
mhm,
should remember that as optimistic as one might be when we think about countries like Brazil or Bangladesh or some nations in
mhm,
Africa. However, so when we think about, excuse me just a second, when we think about countries that might give some hope as being a dissident voice, we should, however, remember that the whole regulations has been unanimously adopted
mhm.
by all nations in the world. And although I do agree with you that there are some parts that sound acceptable, but let us remember that the ultimate goal of the instrument, the essence of the instrument, is to centralize control. And I think, you rightly saw at our event meeting, you reminded us that the regulations, it goes back to the 60s, if not 50s, I think late mid
Well,
mid 50s.
I mean, the origin goes back hundreds of years. Realistically, what we're dealing with was early 2000s after 9/11 and so forth. The name started in 1969. It used to be sanitary regulations, but
Okay,
then
yes, yes.
um,
So what I would like to say, that there is another part that probably was much more in theory, much more as wishful thinking in the 60s, and now it's reality, and it's that of the so-called sharing of information. But the sharing is at the benefit of tracking, of tracing technologies,
right.
of big technologies, of AI learning algorithm, all done with the purpose of enhancing control into our private life, whether or not we are ill or healthy. So there is a control of people who are control of public health policies,
Mhm.
but also a more insidious control into our daily life consumption. We know all of that. So this is to say that as optimistic as we can be, we must keep in mind that unfortunately, no one country of the 194 signatories, because I've said, listen, this is just a no-go. Just stop this,
Right.
because it's going worse and worse and worse. Now, before it was just controlling, that we wash our hands, and now it's controlling how many apples I eat every day. how many pounds of
No,
meat.
absolutely, absolutely. And no, I 100% agree. It, I am optimistic in that there's likely to be difficulty amongst the WHO nations to achieve consensus. Okay, we shall see. My fear, my concern is that Tedros has put this review committee early into the process to do everything possible to try to get consensus before the official working group for the international health regulations meets in mid-November. And I fully expect that they will achieve their goal of coming out of that meeting with, okay, here you go, here's what they've agreed to. And then it's like a freight train going downhill, very, very difficult to stop. What I suspect is that a lot of it will be in language that's very confusing, and people will be like, what does that really mean? So, we'll have to do an analysis of it and see what they're actually doing. What I want to have ready prior to that is, well, given our own view of the world and our own view of what the IHRs are and what they could be if the people had a say, as opposed to the relevant stakeholders. Okay. Um, when you contrast what we would want that all to be compared to what's likely to come out of this November meeting,
Yeah,
it's going to be such a stark contrast
exactly, exactly.
that they're going to have a difficult time selling. They're good propagandists, and they'll put some kind of wonderful sugar coating on it, and they'll have all of the media and the powers that be saying, oh, we got to have this, we got to have this, we got to have this. And the vast majority of people are going to be completely taken unaware of any, they don't, my understanding or my observation of people's understanding of the IHR, it's actually when you dig in and you actually read it, most of it says, well, here's the guidelines, but the individual nations can do whatever they want.
Yes.
Okay. And the problem over the last 2 years, 3 years, is that the individual nations have gone crazy. Okay.
Yes.
But people want to blame the WHO as if the WHO had the legal authority to make the nations behave that way, when all they really did was make a recommendation. And the nations, do it. Now take that scenario and change it to where if the WHO makes a decision, it is then legally binding. That is a totally different situation.
Yes.
Remains to be seen, what they actually plan to do.
Another couple of observations coming from observing the sessions. I must tell you that I don't, because we know that there are the two parallel tracks. I don't remember whether were the sessions for the to-be convention agreement and other international instrument, or better known as the pandemic treaty, or whether were the sessions for the amendments to the IHR.
There hasn't been anything from the amendment, so anything you would have watched predominantly is for the treaty. They might mention the amendments, but it's been super secret, and that's why I'm paying attention to it.
Yes. Well, okay. So I observed a couple of things. One, speaking about propaganda, the rhetoric with which this treaty to be is announced, as though we are really saving the world. Next to this, I also wonder to what extent a number of the delegates that were there are really understanding what is going on. So on the one hand, I think they put the best brains, but maybe only very few, and the rest are people just love to go to Geneva, be in a nice hotel. I'm sorry to be a bit, but I've been in this. No, I haven't been part of the United Nations, but I've been part of European Union's institutions, and so there is people don't spend as much time as they should in reading, studying, and understanding. So when they talk about equity, for them it simply means gives us more money to build hospitals, but that's not the case, because we know very well that all what this WHO wants is to create even a better market for the pharmaceutical products, not to give people the possibility of being cured when they have an accident on the road, So, and I suspect that especially the so-called, so why am I making this point? Well, excuse me, this is a bit indulgent, but it's very interesting. If I find it again, I will capture. There are pictures, I'm sure if you think about it, well, l'état-major, the panelists are in this sort of altar. It looks Masonic. It looks like a Masonic. Oops, maybe now. Okay, it looks like a temple.
Yes, very much.
It's very interesting also. Okay, so all of this is to say that the language, the emphasis, the setting, it's all the music they play. It's all for these people to feel part of this fantastic worldwide movement, etc. So why am I saying this? Because I wonder whether we could think of a ways to, we know already we want to reach this delegate, to reach the delegates. And that's the last thing, I don't have anything else to say. But I wonder whether we could think of ways to reach, for example, some of the African delegates and see whether we could talk to some of them, because for the reasons I said before.
Yes, and across the world, it's a function of you and I and a small handful of people are even aware that these things are going on. There's war in the Ukraine. There's an election coming up in the United States. There's efforts all around the world. And everything is a distraction. The pandemic treaty is a distraction. away from this. Okay. And so my request for everybody, for you, Paula, and for everybody else, as time permits, as soon as possible, look over the people's amendments. Okay. Look over the international health regulations. Look over the article that I just showed you where, how come they're not changing these things, right? Maybe those are the things we want to change because they like them, right? They're leaving them alone, right? Wherever there's, 0 nations wanting to change a given article, you might read that one and go, hey, would like to change that. Where 7 nations are trying to change the same article, hopefully they will disagree on how it is supposed to be changed, or maybe they all want to change it in the same way. But that's certainly something to be concerned about because they're trying to change the status quo. And so we've got a few more minutes, but I'll stop the recording, nice, so we don't get chopped off at the end. Any final words that you would like to say before?
Yes, and is that we need to realize that at the end of the day, behind these individual nations, we understand that there is an overwhelming power. And so things that are left out is probably because, as you say, they are happy with the way they are. And also we should, yes, excuse me, this is the final word. Yes, it's true that the WHO was only recommendations and governments have interpreted them as guidelines, but we understand that very well, that has been because that was the way it worked for governments.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, whether the government, what we have looked at in the past 3 years is that governments who are completely controlled by, we can't say who, they couldn't care less whether that is a rule or that's not a rule. They violated everything. Yes. They violated the constitution, yes. Everything. So this whole battle is it has an enormous symbolic importance, but we shouldn't forget that we have to keep control of the political power as it is exercised, because that goes on no matter what happens in the WHO. They locked us up all over the world. Where the hell in the WHO it says that, as you said?
Right.
Yeah, they did it.
All right. Thank you very much.